Great. Right.
John,
Yeah.
Martin has to leave a little bit early, so things that are for Martin that need to be happening earlier. Also, just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, those are the speakers who haven't sent me their travel cost thingy information stuff. I will be needing that to give money back to people. So that's one thing. Secondly, we have a booking at the same restaurant as we had last night, which is just like, as Robin says, 3 minutes walk away from here, just down there.
To pick up Czech.
It's Czech food, so it's lovely. And what else do I have to say? Robin, do I have to say anything else?
What time is it?
Sorry?
What time?
Oh yes, at 6:30.
So 5 minutes before we can meet at the reception, and we can, but it's I think 2 minutes, not 3 minutes. It's really over the street. So yeah, 5 minutes before.
Do you want to know now if we are not planning on coming to that because we were more welcome in town and see some frog?
Yeah, actually that's a good idea. Who is going to come to the restaurant? Okay, so not many people. All right.
I'm recruiting Emily. This is not my coffee. I'm going to put it somewhere else so I don't have to.
Hey, we're drinking my coffee.
So in retrospect, I probably should have put Martin in yesterday's
which is fine, and I had my say yesterday,
exactly.
So it's fine. Like you can just omit me today.
Yeah,
it's totally fine.
Actually, I'm glad that happened, that interchange happened actually, because there's a kind of natural unit at the individual level and the kind of sociological and historical level. So I don't know if there'll be very much kind of for you today, I suppose. I think so. Again, the same format as yesterday. I'm going to encourage conversation on this end of the table, and then kind of see if there are any questions from the group that are best asked to a group of people rather than individual speakers. Again, to encourage conversation across speakers. So my first question is in some ways the kind of most obvious one, which is the kind of practical instantiations of the relationship between microhistory and macrohistory, right? So the kind of thing, and for that matter, at a sociological level, that too, right? So for example, the kind of work done by the individuals in both sets of pairs, sociological and historical, are there what are the principles, I suppose, right, to help us think about how to put the two levels together, micro and macro, either sociological or historical, and also are there good examples of good collaborative work between microhistorians and macrohistorians, and then also qualitative sociologists who are, as you say, particularists and quantitative sociologists. Are there good models for us to look at for collaboration, putting work together?
I think all sociology should be historicized. So I think that would be a given. And I know that's a critical point often in looking at reviews of journal articles. And I've seen some fellow reviewers critique often is that somebody's not properly contextualizing and historicizing. Even very important contemporary work needs to be put in that historical context. So whether that's done as a collaboration or whether that's the author making sure that it is. And it's very easy to plunge into something and then not bring it into its historical context. And I say that both in the empirical work being historicized, but also in the theoretical work. And people have often commented on that. So, to what extent are you quoting this person, but not actually showing that there was a lineage of discussion? And I think that's some early career scholars sometimes miss out on that. And they might quote somebody very contemporary without saying that actually that person is building on somebody else's work. So I think that's, again, doesn't need to be two sociologists collaborate together, but I think it's really important that it is both theory and empirical data are historicized.
Well, what about just within sociology and comparing the kind of like collaborations between the generalists and the particularists? So I mean, you and David have written papers together, right? Like,
well, some time ago, because we both were looking at one particular case, the 2001 census.
oh, okay.
And so there was a particular case that was of interest both to expand the exploratory part of qualitative research, to expand into what, you know, the big stats tell us. But some people are very opposed to collaborating, and in some sense a lot of anthropologists are opposed to the idea of using large-scale qualitative work, and will, you know, not want to collaborate on grounds of their sense of, you know, the ethics of what they're doing. So I don't think it's a given that people...
Okay. What's the objection?
Some anthropologists I met when I was working at Sussex were very opposed to the idea of the instruments, very opposed to the idea of survey instruments when they would privilege ethnography as a way of describing a culture. A lot of also, I missed the early part of your presentation because I was having my nap, but I was about to say that also I think it's interesting when you were saying here about cross-cultural comparison. And again, there was quite a lot of anthropological discussion some decades ago about, you know, not having this idea of this culturally...
That was the first part of his talk.
Did you?
Yes.
You talk about culturally bounded areas?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. So you heard that. Okay. Thank you for saying that on my behalf. Yeah, so that's what I mean. There would be necessarily this idea that this is not a culturally
Do
bounded...
anthropologists consider you an anthropologist?
No, sometimes they do. I try to go into them, but I didn't have enough in the lineage. I did my PhD in religious studies and sociology of religion. I was examined on my PhD by an anthropologist, Simon Coleman, and I so enjoyed our discussion that I went and I had I had ESRC postdoctoral fellowship with him in anthropology. Some anthropologists are quite polite to me, but I don't have I don't have the lineage. I don't have the lineage in that I didn't study in anthropology. I didn't do field work overseas. And so to a lot of anthropologists, even though there is a move to do anthropology at home, I think the real ticket is going somewhere very far away and doing field work, which I didn't do.
Yeah, it's a weird prejudice, I think. David, from your side, any kind of like examples of collaboration with kind of like...
Well, actually, there's some very well-known collaborative projects involving both qualitative and quantitative sociologists, and the work of Christian Smith is probably most familiar, but the Putnam and Campbell book, American Grace, combines the two. I think a characteristic of those endeavors, though, is that they had very large-scale funding, and so were able to do both survey research and lots of interviews. Most people don't have the funds that would enable them to do all those kinds of things. And I think it's not that most sociologists wouldn't like to do a full mixed methods project, but there are probably not that many people who have skills in both qualitative and quantitative research to do both sides themselves, and so inevitably you're going to need at least two people, if not more, and then you might as well do what you're good in, and then you might as well do it independently as together. You know, I think it's very important to have both quantitative and qualitative research, but as long as it both happens, I don't know that it necessarily has to be done at the same time, together by the same people.
Stephen Bullivant, I guess, does both as well, right?
I think that is, a fair comment. He probably came to quantitative work later, and I wouldn't say he does real social statistics, but he uses numbers.
Right.
For example, I got a colleague who is working mostly in the political sociology, and he's creating these quite complicated models to predict the results of the elections. And he got a lot of elections, so his models are quite good, and they got quite strong predictive power. But each time when the election happened, he's looking for those places when his models were not working. So he's looking into the local politics. So then he's going to those places to check what did happen. Why the model, for example, was predicting that this person should win the elections without any problems, and that person has lost. Or either way, of course. Also. So on that level, he's combining this micro and macro each time, and it's quite interesting idea. But of course, what David said, there are very different ways of doing things, and it's very difficult to be good at those two types of research at the same time. And you are also going to have different questions. So at the end, even it's hard to combine those methods because you are interested in different things.
Right.
You want to have some frequencies, some correlations, or something like that, or do you want to have this understanding of the model that happens, and so on and so on. Right. So it's hard to have the same paper with those two things at the same time.
Go ahead.
I have a question on this, and this is like, so I do very much mostly quantitative work, and I do dabble a bit in qualitative research, and I'm increasingly working with other people who are doing qualitative research, and I've found exactly the opposite of this, that this is like incredibly helpful in everything we do, right? And particularly in like having the qualitative background to inform how we do the quantitative interviews, especially when we're doing cross-cultural comparisons. And I'm wondering why is this different in psychology or I don't know what I do. We're kind of like so my department is like a psychology department with like 50% of the people are anthropologists, so this is how this stuff happens. But I'm wondering why that model, like we found it to work really well, and it's been incredibly productive. And again, with like the Explaining Atheism project, that kind of qualitative and quantitative mixed methods approach has been really helpful in terms of how they're kind of, the qualitative interviews are informing the quantitative research and vice versa. Why is it different? Or how is the tension different?
So are you asking anybody?
Yeah, I'm asking anyone. I just thought
no, I think it's a good question, because I think, as you say, I mean, it's really legitimate to look at, for example, how qualitative research would help inform quantitative research questions. But I think it comes down to the individual preferences also in what people are asking. You know what I'm saying? What is your research question? If your research question is to look at large-scale movements over time, then you probably want to look at large-scale data. But to explore that further, to understand some of those categories, then I think you can use qualitative research to do that. So I think sometimes there is a sense of, is it the same question? But no, there is a move within some anthropology to consider quantitative methods ontological violence, in that they reduce people to numbers. And I'm not one of those, but I think there is that tension, that critique.
I mean, all the anthropologists that work in my department work there because of that. So there are people who do quantitative research or both qualitative and quantitative research and are getting jobs in anthropology.
Because the Oxford Anthropology Department is divided in that way, right? So you have positive experience in part, I think, because you're in the psychology department. If you were in the anthropology department, it might be a little bit more difficult. Like, I know at Harvey's graduate students, when they get examined by two people from two halves of the department, get a really, really hard time. So I think it isn't always very pretty, even for psychological projects, rather than sociological or historical projects. So I was going to ask the same question, but within sort of history rather than within sociology, the kind of like macro distinction and the extent to which people in fact work together, or whether or not it's plausible to work together, cutting across that boundary.
That's problematic, because a lot of people prefer to work alone, so they prefer way of doing things, and that's always a problem. Or they have this tendency, for example, those people who want to do something general, they're using this research made by other people, and those other people get the feeling that they are cheated, or the results are borrowed without enough asking or enough reverence for this researcher. Among the historians, also there's a problem that people tend to be a specialist in one very small area. So it's natural people go to the history sometimes because of that.
Mm-hmm, sure.
So at the end, you feel you are the best specialist, the person that knows everything about the city, right, about this town, about this
city is not very
something like that. And you get this strong feeling that you shouldn't compare this place with any other place.
Sure.
Because it's so special, it's so different. You know that it's different. And if somebody comes to you and say, okay, so I'm going to compare your town with these other towns, and I'm going to create this database, The first reaction is going to be, no, you shouldn't do that, because my town was completely different than that town.
Yeah.
And then and at the end, you also quite often are going to discover that they are using some different categories, some different methods, and it's very difficult to create even this combined database at the end.
But
so it's changing. It depends if you are a cultural historian, for example. Economic historians are different because half of them came from the economy and they got a completely different way of doing things.
Yeah.
But normal historians are always feel that there's a problem with this too general approach.
But even towns seems quite macro these days, right? Like I'm you know, when I read work on like medieval religion in the West, you know, Eamon Duffy writes on like, here, 3 churches in the south of England, and like that's a book, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's enough.
Right, and the cheese and worm book like is one guy, right? So
yeah.
So I mean that's very, very micro even, and I mean like what do you like how much do you use the work of like quite specific micro level historians in the construction of databases?
I think it's a general, not much is,
right.
As this conversation was going, and I was sort of pondering, I think in the field of cultural evolution in general, there's a kind of decoupling between the kind of micro-cultural evolutionary things. If you look at sort of Boyd and Richardson's type of work and their modelling, that's at the micro level, sort of a cultural equivalent of population genetics. Mm-hmm. Whereas what we do is much more at the kind of macro level, and those things are not that well meshed, really.
Right.
And there's a sort of mismatch between the sort of behavioural ecology type models, which model sort of the kind of costs and benefits of sort of individual decision making, versus the more macro kind of stuff, and which is not that well dealt with in the models. Like it only, the role of culture there is, oh, we have these norms, and then we prestige bias or something like that. So there's So I think there's a big missing gap.
Right.
There.
Right.
Can I come in?
Yeah, please.
Like, I mean, a lot of this discussion makes me think of the project that we're running in Bialystok right now, that David's involved in, which is a project to try and understand secularization, where what we're doing is that we're combining results from psychology, from experimental studies, with the kinds of data that David was talking about, sort of large-scale population data, where the methodology that we're using to combine that data is agent-based modeling. Right? Because, I mean, it seems to me, and this is like when you were talking about the gap, this is what made me think of it, like, big problem is that there's this gigantic gap between data about individuals within psychology and data about societies that's coming out of sociology. And because the relationships are not straightforward, they're not linear, you really need that kind of methodology to link them together. So, I mean, we haven't been talking about modeling here at all, but it seems to me that that is one of the possible ways of trying to combine the different methodologies, to get the different methodologies to talk to each other.
Yes, so if you do make this into a book, you should have a modelling chapter.
I'm sure Laurent will write it.
Conrad, that's interesting, because I was thinking, just before you said that there's, talking about where the tension sometimes that arise, but there's a tension also in, epistemology. For example, at Goldsmiths we run criminology courses,
right.
But we're very clearly saying to people, this is critical criminology, it's sociological, it's not psychological. Don't come to us if what you want to do is, mind of the serial killer.
Profile.
Mm-hmm. Again,
Profile.
Galton.
Forensics, we don't do that. Mm-hmm. So we're not saying that, whether it's right or wrong, but there's a certain emphasis, right, and a certain way and approach, and I think that's the sort of thing that we can see happens within disciplines and then sub-disciplines, when then certain people just stop talking to each other, really. And when we interview students to come on the program, we're really clear about that, because we don't want to disappoint them to think that they're going to come and see, something because they don't want. So it is actually quite a different approach, and I think sometimes people don't want to collaborate too closely because they see themselves as not a part of that conversation. In the same way that I gather, I might be out of date, I'm talking about something 7, 8 years ago, that somebody pointed out that within political science, for example, there's very little qualitative research going on. There's not very much ethnography, if any. So within that discipline, there wouldn't be so many spaces to collaborate, because it's not an orientation of the discipline.
Yeah, I think political scientists who do qualitative work are called by political scientists in general think of political scientists who do qualitative work as journalists.
Right.
So like, and that's said disparagingly. Yeah. So I think that's right. There's that huge divide. I was going to ask you, Russell, about what the experts make of collaborating with databases, like when they're asked to fill in these forms and kind of reduce their 7 monographs into yes or no.
You mean on the linguistic work?
Or I mean, it's from any cultural dimension, linguistic or religious. I imagine that it's a bit less aggressive, like less kind of distasteful to them in the linguistic work. But I guess that's an assumption. I don't know if that's justified.
Yes, I think that's probably true, because there's much more tradition of sort of comparative, cross-linguistic comparison, and linguistic typology and so forth. Look, I just think anthropology is so fragmented and polarised that, it really is a problem. In terms of collaborations, I think it's interesting that I'm involved in quite a lot of large-scale collaborations. So, like one paper we're working on has 104 authors, and it's been a bit of a challenge to coordinate that. But I think it was touched on before a bit that to make those things work, to achieve things that none of the individual components could achieve, you do often require funding that kind of brings people together. So large-scale collaborations typically require large-scale funding. Personally, that I've had, lots of connections with people who kind of hate the kind of phylogenetic stuff, but like the concern about the data.
Okay, interesting.
And so, and the concern about the scholarship. So, I think in my talk I was talking a bit about the fact that you don't have to have a disconnect between the sort of quantitative and the qualitative. That in the work we do on the Grand Bank project, all the kind of scholarly discussion can be preserved and recorded. And so, yes, while there is like an entry in a column in a database or something like that, there's all this rich discussion linked to that. Yeah, so you can bring together those things.
Yeah, because my question was actually kind of triggered by that part of the talk, which was that you were talking about the experts disagreeing with one another because that's what we do. But then I thought, well, okay, but what about them just disagreeing with the project about whether or not these are sensible ways to ask particular kinds of questions? Do you get very much pushback?
So we spent the first, for the Grand Bank project, which is the one with 104 authors on it, actually it's 105 now. We spent at least the first 2 years just talking and arguing about the coding. What things to code, how reliable they could be, what was interesting, what was useful, for what purposes. And so 2 years with a couple of meetings a year, and then lots of so that was where the really hard work was done.
Of course, right, yeah.
And there is a different sort of approach or model. Yeah, I'm thinking of the World Religion Database, which is an offshoot of the World Christian Database. And there you have, I know it's odd, religion is a subset of Christianity. At any rate, they're very interested in quantifying adherence for every country in the world. And they've done it. Whether successfully or not is open to debate. But there you have a central, very small team, and they go out and they consult experts on the different countries, including anthropologists, I believe, and say, how many people from this, that, or the other group do you reckon there are? But then ultimately, it's their call who to believe and to what extent. So you're not having to collaborate in quite the same way because ultimately they're in charge.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Any questions from the floor? I see Anna putting her hand up.
This is more of a comment than a question.
So I was just going to say that the database of religious history, which is one that I know a lot about because I know everyone involved in the entire sordid history of that database. So one of the things that they did to deal with some of these problems, other than just finding people who were friendly, was to add comment boxes. And it's really quite fun going through that database, because there are people who just answer yes, no, and then there are people who write essays on each question. Like, it's just this sort of like, so there's some really interesting information about, like, I said yes, but here's all the like caveats to that. So I think like giving people maybe a chance to explain why they don't really like this project in the project itself might have been the thing.
This is not dissimilar to the transparency point, right? Yeah. That you give this sort of richer background text.
And I think because I'm involved, or I'm on their kind of board now, so I think one of the things they've done is move. Initially, there was this very, quite narrow but clear set of theoretical questions that they were interested in. This is the UBC folk, but they were often not really the kind of things that the historians were interested in at all. So there was a sort of mismatch of interests. And so partly why they've kind of broadened out the kinds of data they're collecting is because historians came along and said, well, this is a good kind of structure, but we're not particularly interested in those questions and those kind of units, but we can use that kind of apparatus in kind of ways that fit more with our purpose. That's why they're including, I think, now polls for like objects, religious objects and things. So I think they've evolved to kind of meet the kind of interests of the community more. They've also evolved, I think, to provide sort of teaching type resources.
Yeah, because that is one of my worries in general about the kind of qualitative, quantitative, or macro-micro relationship, is that I think it's not unfair to say, I think, that in lots of cases the quantitative macro folk are kind of exploiting the qualitative micro folk, either treating them as like fodder for hypothesis generation, which we real scientists would then test, because obviously this stuff doesn't count as evidence, right? So that's one, I think, not uncommon view, or simply as background information to help us design our studies. And that relationship seems to me like asymmetrical, uncomfortable, and perhaps unjust. But so that's good to know that you have this change of direction where you have the kind of quantitative folk, right, trying to figure out, right, like how to align their own interests with the qualitative folk.
So that wasn't what I meant. I didn't mean as background information to help. Sure. I just said that it's very informative, and you have both things. You get this like rich context that you can like, that in itself is incredibly useful, but it also helps you not ask stupid questions. Sure.
Can I use a question, I guess, of you and your colleagues, because it strikes me one of the binaries you're looking at is the micro-macro. There's another binary that I'd be interested in hearing more about, which I think maybe is a binary between those who will want to do research in, they might say, lived religion or real-world situations, and those who do experimental examples. And I think must be a tension there. I can see that there would be some. Maybe you could tell us about that.
Sure. So you mean within psychology itself, right? Yeah.
Oh, no. I say within, let's say, the field of religion, there would be some people who say, well, you can't really understand people unless you do ethnography or unless you go out and do interviews in the real world. And there would be people who go, no, we can do an experiment. We can set it up, and we can do a vignette or something. We can test these things. Is there not a tension there?
So, I think for the most part, at least the psychologists who do experimental and cross-cultural correlational work will at least pay lip service to the idea that ecological validity is a problem and a question and all the rest of it, without kind of doing it themselves. There are, I mean, how many people can you name who do data collection in situ? At most 20.
More than that, I think.
But by how many? I mean, it's not by order of magnitude, right?
Well,
a few dozen people.
There were 20 people involved in the CIRC project, right? So, that's one project. So I think you're underestimating the number of people who do biological or cognitive anthropology, and there are hundreds of them, right? Yeah. So it's just, I mean, I think they're people who end up publishing kind of in like evolutionary journals or psychology journals, so you don't really think of them in the same way, but there are lots of them, right?
Now,
there are probably 20 people who study the Hadza.
But it's interesting, right? Because I think we're facing another kind of like bias here, which Abby just mentioned a few minutes ago, which is, wait, so take those people, right? How many of them study like, Friday prayer services in mosques or Sunday services in like churches in the West? Suddenly the number gets very, very small because we still have this exoticizing prejudice, right? Is that to be a real anthropologist, you have to study
need to go
the Hadza.
somewhere foreign, distance. Yeah, exactly. And I think, this is starting to change, but it's just starting to change. And, I think the same with the cultural evolution problem is, cultural evolution as a field or as a field that's more than like 10 people, it's not that old. So, at least these problems are starting to be addressed in some way. And I think that like, and one of the things I think like COVID will have a non-zero impact on this, because I notice this even in my colleagues, like anthropologists who suddenly like, I should start a field site I can get to. And I think that will like the idea that you can actually study people in Glastonbury or people like, we can go to these sites and study kind of lived experiences in. Yeah,
so the work that Martin Lang does is usually data collection in situ in different religious ritualistic sites. And so before I was here a few days ago, I was in Lisbon for a meeting with John Templeton Foundation, and that was almost entirely taken up in talking about how we can do more data collection in situ. The three psychologists who were there. So there's Ben Przicki, myself, and Paddy McCappellin.
Ben Przicki is a cognitive anthropologist.
When we hang out, I think of him as a psychologist. So the fact that we're even invited to the table to talk about these things with funding bodies means, I think, is indication that the psychological sciences are moving in the right direction, I think.
Were there sociologists there at that meeting?
No, actually, it was just psychologists and philosophers. It was quite narrow.
So, the divide that really strikes me, and I think it comes out to me very much in this kind of workshop, for example, is the psychology of religion and the sociology of religion. On the other hand, you would think that the fields would be so close that there would be a lot of interaction between them, and actually, in my experience, there's very little indeed. So, notwithstanding the fact that there's a whole learned society, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, that supposedly brings the two together. In fact, these days, there are relatively few psychologists, I think, who come, so it's predominantly sociological enterprise. And anyway, I think it is kind of a shame. My experience of talking to psychologists of religion is that typically they're pretty unaware of who does what in sociology of religion and vice versa.
Do you have a hypothesis about why this might be?
I don't really accept that, of course, the academy tends to divide up in disciplines, and people have career trajectories that means they do PhDs in particular departments and publish in certain journals, and you end up with academic subcultures that are very much discipline-based.
Within the study of religion that I teach, I'm very careful with my students to say to them, we're not doing psychology of religion.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
right.
So I'm really quite emphatic with them and the other literature they want to look at, but they take that literature and look at the body of literature from sociology and anthropology. Because I'm saying we're looking at group formation, of which psychology is a part, but if we do too much psychology, they go way down this road of looking at religion as individually created, and they go down individualization theses and things that I think are quite anti the sociological framework.
But we do have there are social psychologists.
I know,
right?
I know. So I like the social anthropologists too.
Right,
There's a split there, right? The social anthropologist, the cognitive anthropologist. So within the disciplines, but it's an orientation back to criminology. It's an orientation to how we study the world, and I want my students to think about studying the world in terms of religion as a social force, not an individual manifestation according to how they feel enlightened towards God.
Right.
Okay? Although that's part of that religion, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And so there seems to be a natural kind of orientation. It's an orientation towards either the group or the individual.
Right. Yeah. No, because I share your surprise, David, about the kind of lack of interaction between sociologists and psychologists, because superficially our at least our methods are very similar, right? We'll ask a question, we just get, right? You know, as I said to you yesterday, I'm working now with Feng Yang as an East Asian psychologist of religion, or rather, a sociologist of religion who works mostly on East Asia. But like I have found that those conversations be quite difficult, right? Like we don't seem to think about what looks like very similar things in the same way. So, but I haven't arrived at a hypothesis yet about what causes the difficulty and how we might resolve it. But it is an interesting moat, because on paper it looks like we do very similar things. Yeah.
I wonder if that moat might be breaking down a bit. I mean, there was the International Society for the Cognitive Science of Religion, which I think has changed its name to the International Society for the Cognitive and Evolutionary Science. So I think it's very interesting they added the E word in there, because it's essentially cultural evolution. So, and just having been at that meeting, my impression was that where a lot of the most interesting things are happening now is more of the cultural evolution kind of end. So you have psychologists who are doing cultural evolution studies, and that I think can link a lot more naturally to sociology. So that's I think that's one kind of development. And also people have just moved away from, like, I don't think there was a single talk on the byproduct hypothesis, like some of the things that
Ben Brzezicki, there was a book panel on Ben Brzezicki's book, which very much tears into the byproduct hypothesis as not he didn't say this in the book, but he said it in the panel, that like the byproduct hypothesis has held back the psychology of religion by about 20 years. And so I had also kind of said, because I was on that panel, that like we maybe need to there's some good stuff that came out of it, and I think generally some of the ideas are great, but like there's a huge chunk of it that just needs to be, we just need to let die. And someone came and yelled at me after. Really? So I had someone come up and say, like, I just want you to know that we still study this, and there's really, there are still people who think this is real and studying this. And I'm like, go talk to Ben, he wrote the book. But yeah, it turns out, he upset some people by not talking about the byproduct hypothesis. But
I don't think people are talking about, the fact that they were so defensive, I think, kind of illustrates the point that it's largely history.
But I do think you're right that the moat is being filled, right? I mean, you think about like a lot of us who started off in psychology labs. What was the sample size of your first study?
My first published study, or my first study?
No, let's say your first published study.
2000.
Okay. What about your first study?
My first study. So I did a bunch of stuff on hyperactive agency detection before I decided that this was a really stupid idea, and those were quite small samples. But we never found anything. And I do have some stuff that I really should at some point maybe publish that's interesting with like Krebs experiments, and each of the experiments are a couple hundred people. But if you combine the three of them, it's at least a sizable sample. But I literally haven't published that because while I was in grad school, like I did those experiments, and then replication crisis happened, and then I thought, I don't have time to like run another 400 people in this stupid experiment. So it's just never, but it's like the results are kind of interesting.
But that's the kind of story often told, right? So like I know lots of people for whom our first studies were these lab studies, a couple hundred people, right? And even said, like, parking the replication crisis for a moment, like a lot of us have moved to moving from being experimental social psychologists to being cross-cultural psychologists with like 3,000 or 4,000 people across 4 countries or whatever. And so I think I see more and more of that happening. So I think that's right, that there's a kind of moat being filled, and there's the bridge, the cross between social psychology to something like psychological sociology, I think is happening. Yeah.
I was just going to say I teach a class in psychology of religion that has more sociology than probably psychology in it, but it's cultural evolution, right? I'm teaching cultural evolution. They just won't let me call the course that. But yeah, I teach existential security, a whole lesson or a whole lecture on the 3-hour chunk on the existential security hypothesis. There's tons of there's more anthropology than there is psychology in that as well.
Actually, like Norwich and Inglehart have kind of moved in the other direction in a sense, right? So like in the first edition of their book, it was like objective measures of existential security, but by the second edition, there was a chunk on like subjective, right? What you might think of as psychological measures of existential insecurity. So I think maybe it's not just a one-way bridge, but it's kind of going both directions. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Well, everyone, thank you. This has been a lovely 2 days. Thank you for coming. And as I've been saying, the sessions are archived on the internet, so I would be very grateful if people were to tell others where those sessions are available. Have I sent you everyone the link to it? No, I haven't. I will send the link to everyone so that you can pass it on to others who will find this discussion valuable. Once again, thank you very much, everyone.